The 14th century, a time when the Holy See in Rome became an arena for a brutal power struggle. In the very heart of Christendom, a drama unfolded that historians would later call the Great Western Schism. And at the center of these events was a figure whose name still sends shivers down the spine centuries later. Pope Urban VI. Bartolomeo Prignano, once a humble Neapolitan archbishop, upon ascending to the papal throne in 1378, revealed to the world one of the darkest pages in the history of the Catholic Church. The pontiff, called to be Christ's vicar on earth, transformed into a merciless tyrant, whose dungeons in Castel Sant'Angelo became a place of terrible torture for those he considered his enemies. What happened to a man who received absolute power? How did a pious clergyman turn into a cruel executioner, personally overseeing the torments of cardinals? And why did the Church prefer to almost forget this dark page of its history? Let us delve into the grim era when faith and power intertwined in a deadly dance, and the Holy See was drenched in blood. Bartolomeo Prignano was born in 1318 in Naples, into a family of moderate means. From a young age, he displayed exceptional abilities in academics and a deep interest in theology. Distinguished by his diligence and asceticism, young Bartolomeo quickly attracted the attention of church mentors. Strict discipline and rigid adherence to canons became his defining characteristics, even during his student years. He received an excellent education in Naples, where he studied canon law, a field in which he later became a recognized expert. Contemporaries noted his impeccable reputation and administrative talents, but also his harsh, uncompromising character. Prignano tolerated no compromises on matters of church discipline and morality. This trait, so valued during his ascent up the ecclesiastical ladder, would later play a fateful role in his pontificate. Bartolomeo's career developed rapidly, from a simple cleric to the Archbishop of Bari. His appointment to this post in 1377 was a recognition of his administrative abilities. In ecclesiastical circles, Prignano was considered a talented administrator and an expert in canon law, but not a politician. These were the qualities that attracted the cardinal's attention when Pope Gregory XI died in April 1378. The political situation in Rome at that time was extremely tense. After a long period of papal residence in Avignon, known as the Avignon Captivity, Gregory XI had returned the papal see to Rome only a year before his death. Romans, who had experienced economic decline during the absence of the papal court, were determined not to allow the pontiff to return to France. When the cardinals gathered for the conclave, crowds of citizens surrounded the Vatican, demanding the election of an Italian. An atmosphere of fear and uncertainty enveloped the conclave. The French cardinals, who formed the majority, feared openly supporting their candidate. In these circumstances, Bartolomeo Prignano emerged as a compromise figure. Italian by birth, but neither a cardinal nor a Roman. The cardinals hoped that this modest administrator, known for his piety and strict morals, would be a docile instrument in their hands. On April 8, 1378, amidst the shouts of the Roman crowd demanding an Italian pope or death, Bartolomeo Prignano was elected pontiff and took the name Urban VI. None of those present at the conclave could have imagined that this moment would mark the beginning of one of the darkest periods in the history of the papacy. Urban's election occurred at a unique moment in church history. The Avignon period had left a deep mark on church structures. The papal court was mired in luxury and nepotism, and the cardinals had grown accustomed to significant autonomy. Prignano, who had been a strict administrator and ascetic his entire life, saw these shortcomings firsthand and considered it his duty to rectify the situation. However, the methods he chose to reform the church proved disastrous. Instead of gradual changes, the new pontiff decided to act decisively and ruthlessly, disregarding traditions and the opinion of the College of Cardinals. April 8, 1378. Rome is abuzz. Crowds of agitated citizens gather around the Vatican. "A Roman or an Italian for our Pope?" echoes through the streets of the Eternal City. The cardinals, assembled for the conclave after the death of Gregory XI, feel the mounting pressure. 16 of them are French, accustomed to the luxury of Avignon, and only 4 are Italian. The Romans, weary of 70 years of the papal court's absence, are resolutely determined not to allow the pontiff's return to France. In an atmosphere of escalating panic, the cardinals hastily begin the election. The crowd bursts into the lower floors of the palace with threatening shouts. Bells ring incessantly, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Under these circumstances, the French cardinals do not dare to put forward their own candidate. Attention turns to the Neapolitan Bartolomeo Prignano, a compromise figure, not a member of the College of Cardinals. The election proceeds in haste. When white smoke signals the choice of a new pontiff, the Romans rejoice. Bartolomeo Prignano takes the name Urban VI. The cardinals, especially the French, hope that this humble administrator, known for his piety, will become a docile instrument in their hands. But the very first days of his pontificate shatter these illusions. Urban VI immediately reveals his true character. At the very first consistory, he lashes out at the cardinals with an angry speech, accusing them of simony, luxury, and moral decay. "You have turned the papal court into a house of trade," his voice thunders in the hall. The cardinals are stunned. One of them tries to object, but Urban sharply cuts him off. "Silence, you fool! You're talking nonsense!" In the following weeks, the situation only worsens. The new pontiff forbids cardinals from accepting gifts, restricts their incomes, and publicly humiliates them at consistories. The French cardinals, in particular, bear the brunt of his accusations of betraying the interests of the Church. Urban demands that they abandon lavish feasts, reduce their number of servants, and lead a more modest lifestyle. The cardinals' initial surprise gives way to alarm, and then fear. They begin to wonder, was the election truly legitimate? Did the pressure from the Roman crowd influence their decision? The French cardinals, under the pretext of escaping the summer heat, gradually leave Rome, gathering in Anagni. By July 1378, 13 cardinals openly declare that the election of Urban VI is invalid, as it took place under duress. They declare the papal throne vacant and call on Urban to abdicate. But he refuses, confident in the legitimacy of his election and the divine sanction of his authority. The cardinals' disappointment with the new pontiff is compounded by his unpredictable behavior. Contemporaries note that Urban could be merciful in the morning and fall into uncontrollable rage by evening. He tolerates no objections and considers any disagreement with his opinion a personal insult and betrayal. In September of the same year, a new conclave gathers in Fondi. The rebellious cardinals elect an antipope, Robert of Geneva, who takes the name Clement VII. Thus began the Great Western Schism, which would last 4 decades and split the Christian world. What happens to a person when they receive absolute power? This question inevitably arises when studying the transformation of Bartolomeo Prignano's personality. Contemporaries noted the striking metamorphosis that occurred with the once respected cleric. Dietrich of Nîmes, papal secretary, wrote, "This change puzzled many, for before his election, Prignano was known as a strict but fair administrator. The first signs of transformation appeared the very next day after the coronation. At the first consistory, Urban lashed out at the cardinals, accusing them of corruption and moral decay. When Cardinal de Corsini tried to object, the pontiff rudely interrupted him, a phrase unthinkable from the lips of previous popes. With each passing day, Urban's behavior became more unpredictable. He could be merciful in the morning and fall into uncontrollable rage by evening. Cardinal Jean de la Grange, who dared to express disagreement with the Pope, encountered such a furious reaction that he left Rome in fear. His eyes burned with a mad fire, the cardinal later recalled. He resembled not the vicar of Christ, but one possessed by demons. What caused such a radical change? Historians offer several explanations. One theory links the changes to the psychological effect of absolute power. Bartolomeo, who had spent his life subservient to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, suddenly found himself at its pinnacle. The lack of restraining factors and the conviction of divine sanction for his actions could have eroded his moral compass. Another version suggests that Urban always had a propensity for cruelty, but skillfully concealed it while climbing the career ladder. Having attained supreme power, he simply stopped holding back. Some modern researchers even put forward the hypothesis of a progressive mental disorder, possibly exacerbated by physical illness. An especially alarming symptom was Urban's growing suspicion. He saw conspiracies everywhere, not trusting even his closest circle. When cardinals began to leave Rome, this only strengthened his paranoia. He told his confidants, in August of 1378, Urban received a letter from the French cardinals declaring his election invalid. The Pope's reaction was terrible. He flew into such a rage that he tore the document to shreds and ordered the messenger arrested. This became a turning point. Now, any disagreement with the Pope was considered treason, deserving of severe punishment. On September 20th, 1378, in the small town of Fondi, an event occurred that overturned the history of the Catholic Church. 13 cardinals, having fled from Rome, gathered for a new conclave. They declared the previous elections invalid, having been held under pressure from the Roman mob. Their choice fell upon Cardinal Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII. Thus, two popes appeared in the Christian world, one in Rome, the other initially in Fondi, and then in Avignon. Europe split into two camps. France, Naples, Castile, Aragon, and Scotland recognized Clement. England, Portugal, the Holy Roman Empire, a large part of Italy, and the Scandinavian countries remained on Urban's side. News of the anti-pope's appearance plunged Urban into a state bordering on madness. "Traitors!" he cried at the consistory. "They sold Christ for 30 pieces of silver." His suspicion grew into a persecution complex. He saw conspiracies everywhere, trusted no one. Anyone who dared to express doubt about the legality of his election was declared a heretic. In response to the actions of the rebellious cardinals, Urban made a mass appointment of new ones, creating 26 cardinals in a single day, predominantly Italians. By this, he hoped to strengthen his position, but only intensified the schism of the Church. The schism had catastrophic consequences for all of Europe. Monasteries and dioceses divided in their loyalties. In some cities, supporters of different popes engaged in open clashes. Theologians agonizingly sought an answer to the question, who is the true vicar of Christ? Simple believers found themselves in a spiritual impasse. To whom should they confess? Whose sacraments are valid? For Urban, the schism became a personal tragedy. He sincerely believed in his divine election and considered the confrontation with Clement not a political struggle, but a cosmic battle of good against evil. In his eyes, the anti-pope was not merely a rival, but the embodiment of the Antichrist. With each passing day, Urban's paranoia intensified. He surrounded himself with armed guards, changed his sleeping places, fearing assassination attempts. Even food was checked by special tasters. The pontiff ceased to trust even the cardinals he himself had appointed. In letters to European monarchs, Urban demanded the arrest and execution of the quote-to and his supporters. He promised absolution of sins to anyone who would take up arms against Clement. In fact, the head of the church was calling for a holy war against another part of the same church. In 1383, Urban organized a crusade against Naples, which had supported the anti-pope. This military campaign, which ended in failure, finally undermined his authority and drained the papal treasury. But the worst was yet to come. Within the walls of Castel Sant'Angelo, chambers were already being prepared for those whom Urban considered traitors. The majestic Castel Sant'Angelo rises above the Tiber, like a silent witness to the dark pages of papal history. Originally built as Emperor Hadrian's mausoleum in the 2nd century, over time it transformed into a fortress, a residence, and, under Urban VI, a sinister prison for his opponents. Massive walls, up to 18 meters thick, reliably concealed from prying eyes what was happening inside. After the beginning of the Great Schism, Urban's paranoia reached its peak. The pontiff was convinced that endless conspiracies were being woven against him. In 1385, he ordered the lower levels of Castel Sant'Angelo to be converted into prison cells and interrogation rooms. The dungeons, originally intended for storing provisions and treasures, turned into a labyrinth of suffering. According to contemporary accounts, Urban personally supervised the arrangement of the cells. Narrow rooms without windows, where it was impossible to lie down at full length or stand upright. Iron rings embedded in the walls for chains. Special gutters for draining liquids. Everything was meticulously thought out by a man obsessed with the idea of punishing traitors. The castle's security was reinforced by mercenaries loyal to the Pope. Urban did not even trust the Swiss Guard, who traditionally protected the pontiffs. The prisoner surveillance system included round-the-clock guard duty, regular cell inspections, and complete isolation of prisoners from each other. Particular attention was paid to preventing escapes and suicides. The Pope wanted his enemies to fully experience suffering before death. Prisoners were not given spoons or knives. They had to eat with their hands. Clothes were replaced with simple shirts without belts or ropes. In 1385, the castle's dungeons received their first high-ranking prisoners. 6 cardinals accused of conspiring against the Pope. Among them were Adam Easton, the sole English cardinal, Lodovico Donati, the Franciscan general, and Bartolomeo da Cogorno, the Archbishop of Genoa. By order of the pontiff, the conditions of the cardinals' detention were to match the severity of their quote. They were kept in complete darkness, receiving minimal food and water. Some cells were so small that the prisoner could neither sit nor lie down, forced to constantly stand in a bent position. The most terrifying thing for the prisoners was not physical suffering, but psychological pressure. No one knew when they would be taken for interrogation, whether they would be returned, or what would happen to the others. Screams and moans came from neighboring cells. Urban deliberately placed prisoners so that they could hear each other's torments. A special place in the dungeons was occupied by the interrogation chamber, a spacious room with a high ceiling, where various devices for obtaining confessions were located. Here, under the personal supervision of the pontiff, those who dared to challenge his authority were interrogated. In the year 1385, Urban VI's fears and suspicions reached a critical point. The pontiff, tormented by paranoia, was convinced that a new conspiracy was brewing against him. This time, at the center of the imagined intrigue were 6 cardinals from his inner circle, the very men he himself had elevated after the church schism. Their names went down in history as victims of papal madness. Adam Easton, the sole English cardinal, Bartolomeo da Cogorno, Lodovico Donati, Gentile di Sangro, Giovanni d'Amelia, and Marino del Giudice. All of them were arrested on the same day, accused of treason and an attempt on the pontiff's life. The official version stated that the cardinals planned to overthrow Urban and hand the papal throne to someone from their own circle, possibly Cardinal Easton. The Pope claimed that the conspirators intended to seize him during a consistory, declare him a heretic, and burn him at the stake. The evidence for this conspiracy was, to put it mildly, dubious. The chief witness for the prosecution was the Bishop of Aquila, known for his personal animosity towards the arrested cardinals. His testimony was based on allegedly overheard conversations and his own conjectures. No written documents confirming the existence of the conspiracy were presented. Moreover, Some of the accused cardinals were in different cities at the time of the alleged plotting, making their collusion practically impossible. Historians are unanimous in their opinion that the so-called, quote, zero was a figment of Urban VI's imagination. His increasing suspicion, amplified by the stress of the ongoing church schism and political isolation, created fertile ground for paranoid fantasies. Every gesture, every word of his associates was interpreted through the prism of betrayal. The fate of Cardinal Adam Easton is particularly indicative. This distinguished theologian from Oxford was one of the few non-Italians who remained loyal to Urban after the schism. His only, quote, one, was proposing to convene an ecclesiastical council to resolve the problem of two popes, a perfectly reasonable idea that indeed ended the schism decades later. However, Urban perceived this proposal as a personal insult and proof of treason. After the cardinal's arrest, the Pope ordered an investigation with the use of all necessary means, a euphemism for torture. Interrogations took place in the dungeons of Castel Sant'Angelo, under the pontiff's personal supervision. According to eyewitness accounts, Urban was present during the torments, encouraging the executioners and demanding confessions from the prisoners. One of the papal secretaries, who later fled Rome, described how the pontiff read a prayer book while the cardinals were being tortured, occasionally looking up to observe the progress of the interrogation. Even in the context of brutal medieval customs, Urban's behavior shocked his contemporaries. Torture was usually applied to commoners or heretics, but never to princes of the church. The use of such methods against cardinals, men who theoretically could themselves become popes, was an unprecedented violation of church traditions. Despite all the executioners' efforts, none of the cardinals confessed their guilt. This only intensified the pontiff's anger, convinced that he was dealing with hardened criminals persisting in lies. In his inflamed imagination, the absence of a confession became further proof of the conspiracy's existence. European monarchs, learning of the cardinal's arrest, reacted with alarm. King Richard II of England personally sent a letter to the Pope requesting the release of Cardinal Easton, his subject. However, Urban remained deaf to these pleas, declaring that, quote, the so-called investigation into the conspiracy continued for several months, but yielded no real evidence. Nevertheless, the cardinal's fate was sealed. Urban needed culprits to justify his actions and strengthen his shaky authority. The lack of evidence only reinforced his conviction that a well-organized conspiracy existed. The dungeons of Castel Sant'Angelo became the stage for the full savagery of Pope Urban VI. The interrogation methods applied to the arrested cardinals were astonishing in their sophistication, even by 14th-century standards. The pontiff personally devised a system designed to break not only the bodies, but also the souls of his victims. Interrogations began with psychological pressure. Cardinals were kept in complete darkness, deprived of sleep and food for several days. This was followed by long hours of verbal humiliation as the Pope personally interrogated the prisoners, accusing them of betraying Christ and the Church. He repeated, though it was clear to all that no mercy would follow. When verbal pressure yielded no results, physical methods were employed. The first stage was strappado, dislocating the shoulders. The victims' hands were tied behind their back. They were hoisted up by a rope and then suddenly dropped, preventing their body from reaching the floor. The crunch of dislocating joints echoed through the dungeons. Especially terrifying was the water torture. Cardinals were tied to an inclined board, their faces covered with a cloth, and water was slowly poured, creating the sensation of drowning. This method left no visible marks but caused unbearable suffering and panicked terror. According to Dietrich of Niem, the papal secretary, Urban often attended the tortures. He would sit in a corner of the room, reading a prayer book, as if what was happening before him was an ordinary church ritual. Sometimes he would look up and nod to the executioners, demanding increased suffering for the interrogated. Not only the application of torture, but also its perpetrator was shocking. Traditionally, the Church distanced itself from direct involvement in torture. It was carried out by secular authorities. Urban, however, violated this principle, turning torture into a direct extension of his spiritual authority. He claimed to act in God's name, purifying the Church from the defilement of betrayal. Cardinal Adam Easton later recalled, "The psychological aspect of torture was no less important than the physical." Urban sought not merely to obtain confessions, he wanted to completely break the will of his victims. The cardinals had to publicly admit their guilt, renounce their office, and beg for mercy, which would not be granted. This revealed the pontiff's deep-seated need to assert his absolute power. Every confession, every cry of pain, strengthened his conviction in his own righteousness. For Urban, torture became not just a means of interrogation, but a ritual of power, a demonstration of his might before God and men. Cardinal Gentile di Sangro endured particularly cruel trials. After several days of torture, he was ready to confess to anything. When a pre-written confession was read to him, he signed it with a trembling hand. However, the next day, gathering his remaining courage, he recanted his testimony. Urban ordered the tortures to resume with doubled intensity. Behind the massive walls of Castel Sant'Angelo, a tragedy unfolded that shocked even the most seasoned contemporaries. 6 cardinals, once close to the Pope, had now become prisoners of his insane suspicion. Each of them had their own story, their own path to high ecclesiastical ranks, and their own road to the dungeons of the papal prison. Adam Easton, the only English cardinal, was a brilliant theologian from Oxford. A man of vast knowledge and sharp intellect, he remained loyal to Urban after the schism, rejecting his king's calls to recognize the anti-pope. His devotion was rewarded with a cardinal's hat in 1381. Easton's fatal mistake was to propose convening a church council to overcome the schism, an idea that the paranoid pontiff perceived as a personal insult. Bartolomeo da Cogorno, Archbishop of Genoa, was known for his diplomatic skill. It was he who negotiated with Italian cities, securing their loyalty to Urban at the beginning of the schism. However, when he dared to express disagreement with the pontiff's cruel methods, his name immediately landed on the list of, quote, Lodovico Donati, general of the Franciscan order, was the Pope's own confessor. His asceticism and piety commanded universal respect, but even his closeness to the pontiff did not save him when Urban decided that Donati was too lenient towards the anti-pope's supporters. Gentile di Sangro came from a noble Neapolitan family. His appointment as cardinal was Urban's political move to strengthen his influence in southern Italy. When the Pope's relations with the Kingdom of Naples soured, suspicion also fell on Gentile. Giovanni d'Amelia and Marino del Giudice completed the doomed 6. Both were experienced administrators of the papal curia, experts in canon law, whose only fault was being witnesses to the pontiff's growing madness. In the dungeons of Castel Sant'Angelo, these men, accustomed to honors and respect, faced inhuman suffering. Each of them, in their own way, tried to maintain dignity in the face of pain and humiliation. Cardinal Easton, despite torture, refused to admit his guilt. "I am faithful to Christ and His Church," he repeated. "If my suffering is part of a divine plan, I accept it." After a particularly brutal interrogation, he lost consciousness and was returned to his cell, where he spent several days between life and death. Gentile di Sangro was the first to break under the torment. After water torture, he signed a confession, but the next day found the strength to recant his testimony. "I incriminated myself under torture," he declared. "Before God, I swear my innocence." An enraged Urban ordered the torture to resume with renewed intensity. Bartolomeo da Cogorno tried to appeal to the pontiff's reason. These words only intensified Urban's anger, who saw them as a threat. The youngest among the prisoners was Marino del Giudice. At the time of his arrest, he was barely 35 years old. Physically strong, he resisted torture longer than the others, but even his strength was not limitless. After a week of torment, he could no longer stand. Lodovico Donati, the Pope's former confessor, tried to appeal to his tormentor's conscience. Remember the Savior's teaching on mercy. Do not take upon your soul a sin that cannot be atoned for. Urban replied with a quote from Scripture about the need to cut off infected members of the Church's body. The fates of the imprisoned cardinals are shrouded in mystery. Official papal chronicles state that 5 of them were executed in Genoa in December 1386, and Adam Easton was pardoned at the request of the English king. However, other versions exist. According to one, 2 cardinals died in the dungeons of Castel Sant'Angelo from the effects of torture. According to another, Gentile Di Sangro was secretly strangled on Urban's orders after he recanted his confessions. A third version states that Bartolomeo da Cogorno managed to bribe the guards and escape, but was caught on his way to Avignon and killed by papal agents. The most reliable version is considered to be the one described by Dietrich of Neum, a direct witness to the events. According to him, in December 1386, 5 cardinals were secretly executed in a Genoese fortress. Their bodies were sewn into leather sacks with stones and thrown into the sea under the cover of night. Adam Easton was indeed pardoned, but stripped of his cardinal's rank and exiled to a remote monastery. The fate of the 6 cardinals shocked Europe. Even in an era of cruel customs, such treatment of princes of the Church was beyond the bounds of what was permissible. The kings of France and England sent angry letters to Urban. The Holy Roman Emperor threatened to convene a council to investigate the pontiff's actions. However, Urban remained unyielding, asserting that he acted for the good of the Church. In December of 1386, Genoa, usually a bustling port city, fell into an unsettling silence. Locals cast wary glances at the grim fortress where Pope Urban VI had taken up residence with his court. Rumors spread through the city about 5 cardinals, brought here in chains from Rome. The transfer of prisoners from Castel Sant'Angelo to Genoa was no accident. After an unsuccessful military campaign against Naples, Urban no longer felt safe in Rome. The Republic of Genoa, loyal to the pontiff, provided him with refuge and a secure fortress to hold the captives. The journey across the winter sea became a true torment for the tormented cardinals. Chained, they were kept in the hold of a galley, suffering from seasickness and cold. Witnesses reported that the prisoners' groans could be heard even over the roar of the waves. Urban himself was on the same galley, but in a luxurious cabin on the upper deck. The Genoese fortress, where the cardinals were imprisoned, was an impregnable structure on a rocky seashore. Its dungeons, carved into the stone, were even harsher than those in Rome. Dampness, cold, and lack of light exacerbated the prisoners' suffering. They were placed in individual cells, deprived even of the meager support they might have offered each other in Rome. In Genoa, interrogations resumed with renewed vigor. Physically and morally exhausted, the cardinals could no longer resist. Gentile Di Sangro, once a proud aristocrat, could now barely speak. Bartolomeo da Cogorno, a native of these parts, begged for mercy in the Genoese dialect, hoping to awaken compassion in the local guards. News of the cardinals' suffering quickly spread across Europe. King Charles VI of France sent a special embassy demanding the release of the prisoners. The English monarch Richard II particularly insisted on the release of his subject, Cardinal Adam Easton. Even Emperor Wenceslas of the Holy Roman Empire, a loyal supporter of Urban, expressed concern about the pontiff's methods. But Urban remained deaf to these appeals. In his inflamed imagination, the cardinals embodied all the evil in the world, all threats to his authority. He replied to the monarchs that he was acting by God's will, cleansing the Church of traitors. On the night of December 5th, 1386, an event occurred in the Genoese fortress that shocked even the most seasoned guards. By Urban's order, 5 cardinals were led from their cells and secretly executed. The methods of execution remain a subject of historical debate. According to one version, they were strangled and thrown into the sea. According to another, they were beheaded, and their bodies sewn into leather sacks with stones. Only Adam Easton escaped death, possibly due to the persistent demands of the English king, or because Urban did not want to completely break with England, an important ally in the fight against the antipope. The reaction of European monarchs to the execution of the cardinals was unprecedented. Even those who recognized Urban as the legitimate pope were shocked by his cruelty. Emperor Wenceslas publicly condemned the pontiff's actions. King Pedro IV of Aragon, who had previously wavered between Urban and Clement, definitively recognized the anti-pope. Queen Margaret of Naples, already hostile to Urban, declared him a tyrant and usurper. In ecclesiastical circles, the execution of the cardinals caused a true shock. Many bishops and abbots who had previously supported Urban now distanced themselves from him. Some openly switched to Clement's side. Others, not daring to break with Rome, fell silent, avoiding public declarations of their loyalty. How does a theologian justify torture? This question inevitably arises when studying the theological concepts of Urban VI. The pontiff, who received a classical ecclesiastical education, created a complex theological system to substantiate his cruel actions. At the heart of his theology was the idea of the absolute infallibility of the Pope as the direct vicar of Christ on earth. Whoever opposes the Pope opposes God, Urban asserted in his sermons. This thesis was not new in church tradition, but it was Urban who pushed it to the extreme, excluding any possibility of criticizing papal decisions. According to his doctrine, the authority of the pontiff comes directly from God, bypassing the ecclesiastical hierarchy and councils. Even cardinals, in Urban's view, were merely advisors, with no right to dispute the Pope's will. A special place in Urban's theological system was occupied by the concept of quote. In his theological treatises, he drew a parallel between physical torment and spiritual purification. Quote, he wrote, "This idea served as a direct justification for the tortures inflicted upon his opponents. The pontiff viewed himself not as an executioner, but as a healer of souls, using painful but necessary methods of treatment." It is noteworthy that Urban often turned to the Old Testament, selectively quoting passages about divine retribution and punishment, while ignoring New Testament ideas of mercy and forgiveness. His favorite quotes were words from the book of the prophet Jeremiah about the quote, with which the Lord strikes the wicked, and passages from the Psalms about the righteous punishment of God's enemies. Urban's theological doctrine also included a special interpretation of the concept of heresy. In his understanding, any doubt about the legitimacy of his election or disagreement with his actions was equated with denying the foundations of faith. He asserted, this allowed for the application of all measures provided for combating heretics, including torture and execution, against his opponents. Urban created a precedent where political dissent was interpreted as a religious crime. In his public speeches, the pontiff often drew parallels between himself and biblical prophets, especially Elijah, who mercilessly fought the priests of Baal. He presented himself as an instrument of divine wrath, called to cleanse the church from the defilement of schism and betrayal. This self-perception strengthened his conviction in his own righteousness and justified any means to achieve his goal. Particularly indicative was the speech delivered by Urban to the Genoese clergy in November 1386, a few weeks before the execution of the cardinals. In it, he developed the idea that true mercy sometimes requires cruelty. This perverted concept became the cornerstone of his theology. The connection between Urban's theology and the practice of the Inquisition is evident. He borrowed and developed the methodological and theological principles developed by the inquisitors to combat heretics. However, While the Inquisition formally operated within certain procedures and rules, Urban freed himself from any restrictions, believing that as Christ's vicar, he stood above ecclesiastical law. This position resonated with some of the clergy, especially those who saw the church schism as an existential threat to Christianity. Some theologians of the time did indeed support harsh measures against the supporters of the anti-pope, although few approved of the extremes to which Urban went. The theological legacy of Urban VI had a long-term impact on the development of papal doctrine. Although his extreme views were not fully adopted by the Church, some elements of his teaching on papal infallibility permeated Catholic theology. Centuries and several church councils were needed to balance the concept of papal authority, subjecting it to tradition and the collegiality of the episcopate. History has not preserved the exact protocols of the interrogations of the cardinals or a complete list of the accusations made against them. Most official documents were destroyed after Urban VI's death by his successors, who sought to distance themselves from this grim episode. However, researchers have several key sources that shed light on the events of 1385 to 1386. The most valuable testimony is considered to be the notes of Dietrich of Neheim, a papal secretary and direct witness to the events. In his work, quote, he meticulously describes the arrests of the cardinals, the interrogation methods, and the reaction of the papal entourage. Dietrich writes, another important source is the letters of Adam Easton, the only survivor of the 6 arrested cardinals. After his release and return to England, he described his ordeal in dispatches to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Although Easton was cautious in his wording, fearing persecution, his allusions to quote and quote speak for themselves. The testimonies of Genoese chroniclers are also noteworthy. Giorgio Stella, in his quote 5, describes the arrival of the Pope with the captive cardinals in December 1386. He mentions quote 6 and a quote 7. Of particular value are the diplomatic reports of European envoys. The Venetian envoy in Genoa reported to his doge about quote 8. A French diplomat wrote to King Charles VI that quote 9. Archaeological investigations conducted in the dungeons of Castel Sant'Angelo in the 20th century confirmed the existence of special interrogation chambers. Rings embedded in the walls were discovered, as were drainage systems in the floor, characteristic of rooms where water torture was applied. On one of the walls, an inscription in Latin has been preserved, presumably made by one of the prisoners. "Lord, why have you forsaken me?" An analysis of various sources allows for a reconstruction of the events with a high degree of reliability. The conspiracy of which the cardinals were accused most likely existed only in the Pope's imagination. No serious historical document contains convincing evidence of their guilt. On the contrary, numerous testimonies speak of Urban's paranoid state in the last years of his pontificate. It is significant that even Urban's loyal supporters expressed doubts about the validity of the accusations. Cardinal Peleo da Prata, one of the Pope's closest advisors, gradually distanced himself from him after the arrest of the 6 cardinals. He later sided with the anti-pope, stating that he could not serve a man whose hands were stained with the blood of the innocent. Of particular interest is the question of Urban's personal involvement in the torture. Most sources agree that the pontiff not only knew about the methods being used, but was also present during the interrogations, sometimes giving instructions to the executioners. This unprecedented violation of church traditions shocked even contemporaries accustomed to cruelty. Historical evidence allows us to state with certainty that 5 of the 6 arrested cardinals were executed on Urban's order. Surviving Genoese chronicles indicate that the execution took place on the night of December 5, 1386. The bodies of the executed, sewn into leather sacks with stones, were secretly thrown into the sea. Only a few days later did rumors of the cardinals' fate spread through the city, causing a wave of indignation among the Genoese. Adam Easton's fate was different. At the insistence of English King Richard II, he was released but stripped of his cardinalate, and sent into exile. After Urban VI's death, Easton was reinstated by Pope Boniface IX and spent the rest of his life in Rome, engaged in theological work. His testimonies became the most important source of information about the case of the 6 cardinals. By the end of his pontificate, Urban VI found himself in almost complete isolation. After the brutal massacre of cardinals in Genoa, even his most loyal supporters began to distance themselves from the pontiff. European monarchs, who had previously recognized him as the legitimate pope, now avoided direct contact. Diplomatic letters went unanswered, and audiences were cancelled under plausible pretexts. In 1387, Urban decided to return to Rome. The journey turned into a somber procession. The cities through which the papal cortege passed greeted the pontiff with wary silence. If, before, the pope's appearance caused jubilation and festivities, now people locked their doors and closed their shutters. Rumors of the cardinal's torture preceded Urban. His entry into the Eternal City was devoid of traditional solemnity. Romans, usually boisterous and emotional, maintained restraint. The few greetings sounded more out of fear than respect. Urban, always sensitive to displays of disrespect, perceived this as further proof of a universal conspiracy. The last 2 years of Urban VI's reign were marked by increasing paranoia. He rarely left the Vatican, fearing assassination attempts. Food was checked repeatedly. Water was served only from specific sources. The pontiff changed bedrooms every night, not trusting even his own guard. Church administration was in a state of paralysis. Many positions remained vacant. No one wanted to hold posts near the unpredictable pope. The few who still served in the curia acted with extreme caution, fearing to draw suspicion upon themselves. In this atmosphere of universal fear, the most fantastic rumors were born. It was said that Urban had set up new torture chambers in the Vatican dungeons, that at night he conversed with the ghosts of executed cardinals, that he had made a pact with the devil, selling his soul for power. These stories, however absurd they might seem, reflected how contemporaries perceived the pontiff. Especially burdensome for Urban was the realization that the schism in the Church, despite his efforts, was only deepening. Anti-Pope Clement VII had strengthened his position in Avignon. More and more bishops and monasteries were siding with him. Even in Italy, traditionally loyal to Rome, Clement's supporters emerged. Urban's health, undermined by years of tension and fear, deteriorated rapidly. In early 1389, he fell ill with an unknown malady. The symptoms, severe abdominal pain, fever, clouded consciousness, suggested poisoning. However, modern historians lean towards natural causes. Perhaps it was acute pancreatitis or gallstones. The pontiff's last days were overshadowed by suffering and loneliness. Only a few loyal servants and a doctor, who unsuccessfully tried to alleviate his torment, were with the dying pope. The cardinals, fearing another outburst of anger, kept their distance, awaiting news of his condition. On October 15, 1389, Urban VI died. According to eyewitness accounts, before his death, he regained consciousness and asked for forgiveness for his sins. Whether these words were sincere remorse or the fear of death remains a mystery. The pontiff's funeral was without much pomp. A small procession escorted his body to St. Peter's Basilica. Official chronicles reported the sorrow of the Romans, but contemporaries noted rather an atmosphere of relief that spread throughout the city. The cruelty of Urban VI had far-reaching consequences for the entire Catholic Church. His reign became a turning point in how European society perceived papal authority. If previously the pontiff was seen as an unquestionable spiritual authority, after the bloody events in the Castel Sant'Angelo and Genoa, even the most devoted Catholics began to ask, can the Vicar of Christ act in such a manner? The first and most obvious consequence was the deepening of the Great Western Schism. Many bishops and monarchs who had previously supported Urban switched their allegiance to the Avignon antipope Clement VII. Others, unwilling to openly break with Rome, adopted a wait-and-see attitude, effectively distancing themselves from both pontiffs. The schism, which could have been overcome by diplomatic means, turned into a protracted crisis that lasted for 4 decades. In theological circles, serious discussions began about the limits of papal power. Scholars from the universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna developed theories limiting the absolutism of pontiffs. The concept of, quote, zero was born, the doctrine of the supremacy of the ecumenical council over the pope. This idea, unthinkable before Urban VI, became dominant in 15th-century church thought, and ultimately led to the convocation of the Council of Constance, which ended the schism. An even deeper shift occurred in popular consciousness. Ordinary believers, accustomed to seeing the Pope as an example of Christian virtues, were shocked by stories of cardinals being tortured. Pamphlets and ballads portraying Urban as a tyrant and torturer spread through the cities of Italy and France. Some of these works have survived to this day, demonstrating the extent of contemporary disillusionment. Particularly indicative is the popular ballad, quote, One, which emerged in Genoa shortly after the execution of 5 church hierarchs. In it, the Pope is compared to Emperor Nero, and the castle where the prisoners were held is likened to hell. Such works, spreading throughout Europe, undermined the moral authority not only of Urban, but also of the papacy as an institution. Canon law also underwent significant changes. After Urban's death, his successor, Boniface IX, initiated reforms limiting the pontiff's ability to unilaterally decide on the punishment of cardinals. A complex procedure was introduced, requiring the consent of the majority of the College of Cardinals for serious sanctions to be applied to its members. In the political sphere, Urban's legacy manifested in the strengthening of secular power over the Church. Monarchs, appalled by the Pope's abuses, became more actively involved in church affairs, limiting the powers of the Roman Curia in their domains. This process, which began as a reaction to Urban's tyranny, in the long term led to the formation of national churches under significant state control. The pontiffs themselves, after Urban, became much more cautious in exercising their power. Boniface IX and his successors diligently cultivated the image of merciful pastors, avoiding conflicts with cardinals and demonstratively showing respect for church traditions. In fact, Urban's cruelty created a peculiar anti-example for future popes, showing what unlimited power in the hands of one person could lead to. The image of Urban VI in historical memory has undergone a remarkable transformation. A man whose reign was marked by unprecedented cruelty gradually faded into the shadow of more prominent historical figures. Paradoxically, the pontiff who tortured cardinals in the dungeons of Castel Sant'Angelo is almost forgotten by the general public today, unlike other controversial popes such as Alexander VI Borgia or Julius II. In the first decades after Urban's death, the Catholic Church sought to distance itself from his legacy. Official chronicles mentioned him sparingly, avoiding details of his cruelty. 15th-century historians of the papacy, such as Platina, described Urban as a strict but just pontiff, whose firmness was necessary during a period of schism. The torture of cardinals was either not mentioned at all or justified by the need to combat conspiracy. During the Renaissance, when humanist ideals permeated historiography, the assessment of Urban became more critical. Historians like Guicciardini no longer hesitated to call him a tyrant and a fanatic. In his History of Italy, he wrote, "Urban stained the Holy See with blood that even centuries could not wash away." Protestant authors of the 16th century made a special contribution to shaping Urban's image. For them, the cruelty of the Roman pontiff became an ideal illustration of the thesis of the moral decay of the papacy. In pamphlets of that time, Urban was depicted as the embodiment of the Antichrist, and the torture of cardinals as proof of the satanic nature of papal power. In the Age of Enlightenment, the history of Urban VI became an argument in the hands of philosophers who criticized religious fanaticism. Voltaire, in his quote, mentioned him as an example of how religious power corrupts even initially virtuous people. Quote, he wrote, "The romantic 19th century, with its interest in the darker sides of the Middle Ages, once again turned its attention to the figure of Urban. In historical novels of that time, he often appeared as an ominous character, embodying dark forces opposing progress and freedom. A particularly vivid image was created by Victor Hugo in his unfinished novel, Quote, where Urban is presented as a tragic figure destroyed by his own power. In the 20th century, with the development of scientific historiography, attempts were made at an objective analysis of Urban's personality and deeds. Historians sought to understand the psychological and social factors that led to his transformation. Works appeared that viewed him not as a monster, but as a complex personality, acting within the context of his era. Modern researchers, such as Diana Wood and Yves Renoir, suggest seeing Urban not just as a cruel tyrant, but as a man who became a victim of a system of absolute power. They point out that the institution of the papacy in the 14th century lacked effective mechanisms of restraint, which created conditions for abuse. In popular culture, the image of Urban VI remains little known. Unlike the Borgias or Medici, he rarely becomes the hero of films or novels. Perhaps this is due to the fact that his cruelty was directed not at political opponents, but at his own cardinals, a fact so shocking that it is difficult to integrate into popular narratives about the Middle Ages. The story of Urban VI makes us reflect on the nature of power and its influence on the human psyche. How did a pious cleric turn into a cruel tyrant? What happens to a person who receives absolute power without a system of checks and balances? These questions are relevant not only for understanding the distant past, but also for comprehending modern mechanisms of power. Urban VI reminds us that institutional violence is often masked as the protection of higher values. He tortured and executed in the name of church unity, using religious rhetoric to justify his actions. This mechanism of sacralization of violence can also be observed in modern religious and ideological systems, which makes the study of his history particularly important.